This week, Syrian rebels toppled the regime of President Bashar al-Assad, capturing Damascus and forcing Assad to flee to Russia. In the aftermath of the fall, Israel is now conducting airstrikes against strategic targets in Syria. Take a look.
Tonight, with Syria convulsed in revolutionary chaos, its neighbor Israel taking decisive action. Israeli warplanes carrying out strikes across the country, leaving this airbase near Damascus in flames, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. The target, Israel says, military sites, including the Assad regime's stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons.
Joining us from Israel is Middle East analyst and director of research at the Middle East Forum, Jonathan Spire. Jonathan, thanks for joining us.
Sure, thank you. Good to be here.
So, we could talk about the Israeli strikes. I got a bunch of questions about that. But why don't we kind of pull out to the 35,000-foot view here? Because everyone that I've talked to who kind of passingly pays attention to this, knows a bit, but not a ton, is asking me the same question. Is this a situation that, a power vacuum after Saddam Hussein was overthrown in 2003 or after Gaddafi was overthrown in Libya, that this vacuum is being filled by Islamist groups, people that used to be Jabhat al-Nusra, an al-Qaeda affiliate. Somebody who is in jail and on a terrorism wanted list in America. What is going on? Should we be concerned that the hideous Bashar al-Assad is being overtaken by somebody who's equally as hideous?
First of all, without any question, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, is a Salafi jihadi, a very extreme Sunni Islamist organization. There's a basic difference, of course, between the situation here and Iraq in 2003, in the sense that then there was a vacuum because the United States had taken, its allies had taken down the regime. In this case, HTS, has produced its own vacuum and then filled it, so to speak. It was the agency, so to speak, that destroyed the Assad regime, and it therefore, by default, kind of gets to be the next government because that's the way this stuff tends to work. As you mentioned a moment ago, until 2016, this was the official franchise of the al-Qaeda network in Syria. Its leader, Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, or Ahmed Shara, as his real name is, began his career as a member or militant with the al-Qaeda network in Iraq, which, in that brutal global network, nevertheless had a reputation as a particularly violent and particularly sectarian franchise of al-Qaeda, led by the late psychopath Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, will be remembered to American listeners, I think. So yes, there is a great deal to be concerned about. There is, of course, a sophisticated PR campaign going on right now around al-Jolani, in which he's been taught the right lines to say for obvious reasons, that he's now a moderate, that he's no longer sectarian, and so on and so forth. No, there's every reason to be suspicious, and there's every reason to be concerned. The day that Assad fell was a great day because the Assad regime was a truly brutal and wicked regime, and the evidence now coming out of the Sadnaya jail is dreadful, but frankly shouldn't surprise anybody. Nobody has an excuse to be surprised because Syrians have been raising the alarm about Assad's practices in Sadnaya and other jails for years now. So it was a terrible regime. What's taking its place is an emergent Salafi jihadi Islamist regime, and that's something also to be concerned about. So it was a defeat for some very bad people. It wasn't particularly a victory for good people. It was a victory for Sunni political Islam, Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, with Erdogan's Turkey and Qatar behind it. Those are the winners so far.
So if we look at what's happening vis-a-vis Israel, carrying out strikes, sort of entering the UN buffer zone on its border of Syria, there's a lot of dumb people who suspect, there goes Israel again and its imperialist adventures. They're after something very specific here. Can you tell us what is kind of motivating these Israeli strikes and, what they're hoping to gain? Clearly it's not a chunk of Syrian territory.
Yeah, what I think it very clearly is that Israel simply wants, in the kind of twilight zone between two regimes, with the Assad regime gone and the al-Jolani new regime not entirely consolidated yet, what Israel wants to do is to render the emergent Sunni Islamist regime in Syria as militarily helpless and as militarily harmless as can possibly be achieved. Safe in the knowledge, or secure in the knowledge, and I think it is an accurate assumption clearly being made that that regime will be deeply anti-Israel, and once it consolidates itself, it will mean Israel harm. Al-Jolani is very clearly a sophisticated and patient tactical operator. The guy, after all, sat quietly in Idlib province for a half a decade, with more impatient spirits telling him, oh, Al-Jolani's pulled out of the game, Al-Jolani's no longer fighting Assad, what's going on? Biding his time, until November 27th, and then we saw everything that's followed. So he's patient, but he will surely wish to build up a force capable of being hostile to Israel. Israel is setting him back as far as it possibly can.
And you said sitting patiently on his hands in Idlib for all that time. I mean, they were running Idlib province, weren't they?
Oh, they were the government. They absolutely were. They had their own government in Idlib, which it had a name, which is the Syrian Salvation Government. They called it. Even the same figurehead prime minister, Mohammed al-Bashir, who al-Jolani has just slotted into be the interim prime minister.
So
of Syria.
What can we gain? What can we sort of draw from that time of ruling?
Yeah, sure. So what we can draw from it exactly is, and that's the exact correct question, is that this was a very repressive form of Sunni Islamist rule. It was not lurid and psychotic in its brutality in the form that, let's say, the Islamic State Caliphate was during its mercifully short existence between 2014 and 2019. Jolani's not a florid psychotic in the way that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was. It was a deeply repressive, deeply oppressive form of Sunni Islamic governance of a kind which I think is now about to be introduced across Syria.
And so what I think many people maybe do know or don't really understand the depth of is that, the confessional makeup of Syria is pretty complex, right? Alawites and Christians, and I mean, obviously there are no Jews left, as is the case in every Middle Eastern country, right?
But yeah, Jews, I mean, if you
they're two or something, right?
Three. This is the figure I've heard.
You have three of the bravest Jews on earth are probably in Damascus right now. But if you look at this, I mean, obviously that is the concern. The Kurds, of course, too, is the treatment of minorities and religious minorities. How does that look so far? Because I'm hearing mixed things. You're closer to this and you pay very close attention to it. I've seen videos, can't be verified, that people are being, pushed out of their homes, tortured, etc. But others that say, look, they seem to be calm so far. The signs so far are good. What do you make of it at the moment?
I mean, first of all, they've only literally had a few days. So, it's very, very early to tell. And history is replete with examples of movements that come to power and in the initial period, are keen to say, no, nothing to worry about. Everything's normal. There's still electricity. Yeah. We're normal people. And then within 6 months to a year or whatever, it's a totally different picture once they get consolidated. This is first of all. Secondly, with regard to the new Syria, the post-Assad Syria, it does appear that at least certain elements of the victorious side aren't wasting any time at all. As I say, there are verifiable clips that have already emerged of the summary execution of both former Assad soldiers and individuals associated with the old regime, and also soldiers of the Kurdish forces, the Syrian Democratic Forces that are fighting against the Islamists further east in Syria. So undoubtedly, summary executions have begun. There is not an indication yet that Jolani himself has ordered anything like that, and I don't think he has. It's not in his interest to do so. But certainly there are individuals or groups among the victorious rebel side, so to speak, who are already carrying out their own forms of justice. And frankly, after more than 50 years of repressive rule deeply associated with the Alawi community, I think many of the Alawis themselves and many observers too are just not going to be surprised if people, once they see the sites coming out of Sadnaya and the rest of it, begin to take matters into their own hands. So the likelihood of sectarian retribution and sectarian violence in Syria is very high, and there already are some indications that it is taking place. There are not indications yet that any of that type of violence is being led or ordered by HTS, which tends to be a fairly well-disciplined organization compared to some other groups in the country.
The West and certain elements of the West have a bit of leverage here, right? I mean, obviously, the Assad regime was propped up by two other hideous dictatorships in Russia and Iran.
Yeah.
And I saw somebody from the new leadership today saying, look, our coffers are empty. We have a bank full of Syrian pounds and they're worthless. So, I mean, they need support. They need support from other countries. Who do you suspect will step in here to try to stabilize the situation and kind of garner some influence with this new regime?
Yeah, first of all, they are short of money. That's true, and I do think that some of the behaviour of Al-Jolani and his guys is informed by that. They are certainly trying to convey some kind of an image of normality. You know, flimsy or thin as that may well be, the effort itself is notable, so to speak, and that effort clearly is taking place. Who will step in? I suspect that the Emirate of Qatar is going to be high on the list of countries which will be concerned to assist this new emergent regime. The fact is that Qatar has been one of the main backers of HTS all the way back when it was called Jabhat al-Nusra. You know, it was a client in many ways of Emirate of Qatar. The Qataris, of course, have deep pockets indeed. They can help people they want to help. And I would suspect that they will be certainly one of the main backers of this new regime. And I suspect that Turkey also. Turkey has less money to spare, of course, than the Qataris do, but they have skills and abilities and infrastructure and organizational capacity. And I think they will very much be behind this new regime too. In many ways, let me say, I think this hasn't been sufficiently discussed on much of the coverage. Jolani's ride down to Damascus also represents a tremendous strategic victory for Turkey and for the vision of President Erdogan, for reasons I can go into if it interests you. But, you know, it really is his day as much as it is Al-Jolani's day. And I think Turkey will be very keen to ensure the success of this emergent new regime.
John, let me ask you one final question. And it's a big one, but I think you probably have a concise answer to it. Without the horrible pogrom on October 7th, do you think any of this would have happened? Do you think Assad would have fallen?
Concisely, I do not think it would have happened. For the following reason, I think it's a very specific reason. Yes, the fact that there are other issues too. The fact that the Russians couldn't help out wasn't to do with October 7th. It was to do with their equally foolish decision to invade Ukraine in February 22. But the fact that the Iranians couldn't help out because they're too busy with their seven-front war against Israel and being frightened of Israeli raids on Iran. And most centrally and importantly, the fact that the Lebanese Hezbollah organization couldn't cross the border was because of October 7th, October 8th, i.e. when Hezbollah entered the war against Israel, and then Israel's decimation and crippling of Hezbollah that has taken place since September of this year. You know, Jolani came down to Damascus with between 20 and 30,000 jihadis. Had Lebanese Hezbollah been intact, and had it not been at war with Israel, it's absolutely the case that they could have crossed the border and almost certainly smashed Jolani's people to pieces. They weren't able to do that, and therefore he faced the rotting and useless and pitiful forces of the Assad regime that crumbled before him. But had Hezbollah been there and intact and ready for action, this, I think, would almost certainly have been a very different story. So yeah, without October 7th, I don't think you have the downfall of Bashar Assad's regime.
Jonathan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for the invitation.